We're live.
So you're on a screen.
Yep. Great.
All right, we're good now?
Yep, we're good.
We're live, all right. All right. Hey, if folks can hear me, we're going to get the program started here. So if you would, grab a drink, grab some food, and please join us up here in the seating. And we're going to get started. Thank you.
Afterwards, please. Yeah.
Carol's got the live stream going. So, Carol, if you can join us up front once you get that angle just right.
There we go.
Mike, if you can join us. Yeah. Okay. Well, as folks are getting the last drink and getting some food, getting settled, I'll get things rolling here. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, or for folks who are watching streaming online, my name is Chris Lewis, Vice President of Public Knowledge. And if you're new to Public Knowledge, we're a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. And Public Knowledge, we work on a broad range of technology policy issues, advocating for free expression and affordable access to technology. And we want to thank our sponsors, first of all, who helped us put this on tonight. First, the team at Mozilla, who sponsored for tonight, as well as the folks over at Postmates. We really appreciate you guys supporting this event and supporting our work. We also want to thank folks here at our host venue. Hey, welcome, come on in. We want to thank the folks here at Galvanize, where we're holding this event in San Francisco. The whole team here has been great. They've got a fantastic space. That's their food that we order, so if you like the food, order food from Galvanize if you're in San Francisco. But Heidi and Mario, Taya, Andy, Bernadette, Victoria, the whole team here, you guys have been fantastic. We really appreciate you letting us come here to talk policy. And for those who are streaming online, if you're watching this, you can follow this conversation on Twitter. Use the hashtag Digital Platform Act, which is up here on the screen. Or just keep following Digital Platform Act for conversations about the people and about this conversation generally, coming from Public Knowledge and all of our allies. So we have two parts of the program today. So we're going to kick off part one. But first, I wanted to just remind folks about why we're holding this event and why we think this conversation is really important. Because, as I said, we're a DC-based organization in Washington, and there's a lot of conversation about what people are calling the tech clash in Washington, backlash against technology companies. And that conversation that we're engaged in and folks are engaged in Washington really seems to be centered around pushing certain priorities, certain values around innovation, free expression, competition, and consumer choice, but also balanced with interest about fighting hate speech, fighting piracy, fighting extreme and terrorist content online, and promoting quality journalism. And all of those values are wrapped up in a really complicated conversation that led to Public Knowledge and our author, Harold Fell's writing the people that we are promoting today. And we don't think those values are mutually exclusive, but we think that when we make good policy around those values, that it's important that we have facts rise to the top, that technical experts are listened to, and that all stakeholders at the table to make sure that those values are balanced. And so that's what led us to ask Harold to put this ebook. And we hope that it will be a framework for ongoing conversation. We know not everybody's going to agree with everything in the book. That's also a good thing, but we want to have people engage with it. We want people to engage with the ideas and be a part of the conversation. We don't think that securing the a digital marketplace is going to be achieved by the goodwill of companies alone. It requires a public conversation that leads to smart policy that's analysis-based. And so that's why we want to have this event, have further conversations like this. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to part one of the event, and then I'll come back to part two. But part one of our event is a one-on-one conversation with the author of a really fantastic ebook called The Case for the Digital Platform Act, Market Structure and Regulation in Digital Platforms. And some of you, when you came in, we were handing out the check-in. We have the executive summary of the book, and on it there's a QR code that can take you to where you can download the book, or you can just go to digitalplatformact.com, download the ebook, check it out. We also have some QR codes floating around upstairs and downstairs here. We hope you'll read the whole book if you haven't, and get back to us with open knowledge and tell us what you think about it. But here to talk about the book is Harold Feld, who was our author at Open Knowledge. Harold is Senior Vice President of Open Knowledge, and his book is, by our site, available on our website, available at digitalplatformact.com. And today, we're very lucky that joining Harold in the conversation is journalist Mike Swift. Mike is Chief Global Digital Risk Correspondent at MLX.
It's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. At MLX Market Insight. And Mike's a talented, award-winning journalist who has been covering antitrust policy, covering regulatory policy around the tech industry for many years. Before MLX, he was with the San Diego News and SiliconValley.com. He's only cut his teeth in New England at Hartford Current, the oldest, longest-running,
Oldest continuously published newspaper in America.
There you go.
Older than the Republic.
Older than the Republic. So if you're from Hartford, let's go. So we're very lucky that he's here to help us engage in this conversation. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to Mike and to Harold. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. If I keep moving around a little bit, it's because I have the sun going right into my eyes. So, but we'll muddle through as the sun moves. Thanks for being here. I think we really want this to be a dialogue. We're going to leave time for your questions. I see a lot of great policy people out here in the audience, and we want to have a chance for you to interact a little bit with Harold as well. So we'll make sure to do that. This morning, thanks to the magic of the international dateline, I started the day in Seoul, Korea, and where my news organization, MLX, has really been writing about how the Koreans are really looking at blowing up their whole privacy enforcement system, which is kind of interesting because they have one of the strictest privacy enforcement apparatus in the world right now. But they feel like it's important to be much more in concert with the European Union. So they're basically remaking the three agencies that enforce privacy in Korea, putting it down to one with the goal of getting an adequacy agreement from Europe. And sort of the basis behind that belief is that they're not doing this for the big companies like Samsung and LG. They're doing it for really small, medium-sized companies, startups. They really want to open that market to Europe. They want to open up Europe to those small players. And I just think that's kind of interesting because the Koreans believe, in this case, that more regulation can actually mean more products, better products, more innovation. And I think people like me in Silicon Valley for the past 15 years haven't always had that belief. I think after 15 years reporting here, I often thought that thanks to Section 230 and the fact that Washington got out of the way of Sand Hill Road and Y Combinator is the reason why we have these amazing products that we do today. And I think 2018 maybe told us that that approach is not going to work anymore, and we need to find a different one. And that's why I'm really excited to be here talking to Harold about his book, The Starfish Problem. And so why don't we jump right into that? So just a few hours ago, Mark Zuckerberg said that the government should not take a big hammer to Facebook or the other big platforms. As we speak, Elizabeth Warren's on the stage debating with other Democratic candidates, no doubt talking about antitrust. And this looks like this year is going to be the first. 2020 is going to be the first time since 1912 where antitrust is actually a real issue in the presidential campaign. And you know, so much of when we hear about this debate, it's really about, you know, should we just break up the big tech companies, take a big hammer, as Mark Zuckerberg put it. And you know, it sounds good because it sounds like what Teddy Roosevelt did with Standard Oil, you know, back a century ago. But you know, why is that the wrong way to think about this problem?
Well, I call this the Starfish problem precisely because you spent a lot of time in New England. I grew up in New England, and one of the things that I used to hear a lot was that the lobster fishermen would have this problem with starfish. They'd come in and they'd get into the lobster traps and, you know, ruin the catch. So initially what they would do is just tear up the starfish to kill them and throw them back in the water. And what happens, of course, is the starfish grow back. Not only does, you know, a starfish grow new arms, sometimes you tear a starfish up into a bunch of different pieces and you get 3 or 4 new starfish because they just regenerate. So what I call the starfish problem is when we look at the tech sector, and particularly this area of digital platforms, which I argue in the book is a clearly definable sector of the economy. We have to ask ourselves, why did this end up this way? It wasn't a Standard Oil thing where there was one genius who was a master of cartel who put all of this together. What happened was economic forces drive these companies to particular strategies of market dominance. And we've had a bunch of reports coming out from the antitrust experts in Europe, in the United States, in the UK, and pretty much the consensus is that these platforms experience really huge network effects. They get enormous economies of scale and can scale up quickly. That creates the urge to do blitz scaling. Just crank it up until you dominate your segment of the market. So we can't just smash them up and expect that they'll stay smashed up. We need to have in place a regulatory regime that addresses pretty much all of the issues and concerns that are coming up, because these problems are not just different and separate. I don't know whether I agree with Mark Zuckerberg about don't break up Facebook. I think that has to be on the table, even though we shouldn't kid ourselves about how, you know, easy that would be. But the answer might be that he's right. We shouldn't. That there are other things we should do, like interoperability and unbundling. But the one thing he said that I totally agree with is breaking up Facebook is not going to solve the content problem. And we need to understand what we're trying to do when we're intervening in the market, whether it's regulation to make the market work better, whether it's regulation to preserve our fundamental values about democracy, and whether it's antitrust intervention to break up companies that have gotten too big. We've got to know what we're trying to do.
So you don't have to go back to the book of Ecclesiastes to know there's nothing new under the sun, right? And you know, a century ago we had many other innovative communications technologies, the telegraph, the telephone, the radio. What sort of issues did they have? Did they raise? And can we learn from, you know, what the response was to those technologies?
Right, and it's important to understand that a lot of the issues that we're talking about, network effects, scale, economies of scale, concerns about democracy, all go back to this 150 years of evolving disruptive communications technology. Human beings are at heart communicating creatures, and we think to ourselves, wow, Facebook's the first thing that has linked together 2 billion people. Well, actually, the telegraph was the first thing that linked together 2 billion people. Not all at once. You know, it wasn't exactly the same, and we shouldn't just think it was exactly the same, but, you know, if you look at the question of, you know, what was enabled by these new disruptive technologies, news from around the world, commerce happening almost immediately as compared to the old standards when it used to take months to send a message. And then the flip side of how the telegraph companies became information gatekeepers, how they manipulated elections, how you couldn't confirm, and we see this over and over again. I have a great article from Columbia Law Journal in 1939, the Federal Communications Commission and Radio Censorship, which asks, well, we don't like all the hate speech that was on radio, and we don't like deceptive advertising, but, do we really want the government to be making these decisions through license renewals and, private censorship, government censorship? If you scratch out, radio and put in Facebook or, YouTube, a lot of the arguments that you see there would resonate with us today.
So what is the consequence of doing nothing? Because it's clear that over the last year, the regulators have gotten the attention of Facebook, and Google and the other big platforms. Can't we really trust that now the heat is on, that and they know they need to change, that Facebook's army of security specialists and their new AI tools are really going to be able to deal with this problem?
Well, first of all, they can't. Number one, this isn't about a single company. It's not like, do I like Facebook? It's not, do I like YouTube? And not, do I like Facebook and YouTube? So I think Twitter does it. This is about a sector of the economy. And if we take off the hat that wants to make this a revenge story about evil people doing bad things, or kind of a Frankenstein story of people tampering with that which should not be tampered with, and actually start thinking about this in terms of policy, we recognize, look, this didn't happen by accident, and there's no good way for companies to deal with it internally, even if they want to. For one thing, they have all the wrong incentives. For the other thing, there is no person named Facebook. Even Mark Zuckerberg doesn't actually control the day-to-day operations of Facebook. And let me pick on some other companies because, part of this is it's very easy to pick on Facebook right now. But, Reddit just suspended the Donald Trump subgroup because there were physical threats of violence. And Reddit is by no means a dominant platform by any single measure. But if we care about consequences of content moderation, depending on what we're trying to do, then we do or don't care about what happens on Reddit. So I think, first of all, my message to everyone about, who cannot get over their techno-determinism and hardcore libertarianism, get over it. Please, get over it. Think every time you drive down the street, you are not engaging in micro-negotiations with people about whether to stop at red lights or on which side of the road to drive on. Because believe me, those are totally arbitrary decisions that we could have let the market resolve. But it turned out to just be so much easier to say, okay, you drive on this side, and when this little light turns red, you stop. And we all agreed to it, not because it was intrinsically more efficient than having it be green be stop and red be go, but because you had to choose something. Rules make markets work better. Now, you can write rules that make markets work worse. You absolutely can do all sorts of crappy things with rules. It's not like all rules are good. But the plain fact is that you do nothing, and this is the world we're going to get, and it's going to keep being this world. Because if you look at what drives it, it's not because, we just need to twist the tail of these guys and make the nerd harder. There's real underlying issues of economics, limitations on human beings. And finally, I will acknowledge this freely in the introduction of my book, and a lot of people disagree. I believe it is the fundamental role of government to set the rules for society. That in a free and democratic society, we don't outsource this to a handful of giant companies where they promise to behave. That it is actually the job of government to set the core rules about what kind of communications are we going to allow, what threats of violence or negative things do we find put society at risk, and what kind of a business environment are we going to have in terms of moderating these enormous network effects and economies of scale.
So let's talk about the term platform, because I'll plead guilty to this. I throw that term around a lot in my writing, and I think I probably have kind of a hazy definition of what it actually is. How do you define it, and why did you choose it as really the organizing principle for the Starfish problem?
Yeah. First, let me say, in the last couple of months, we have seen a number of reports come out from the European Union, the United Kingdom, different antitrust centers here in the United States that have come out with conclusions that echo a lot of what I have in the book, for which I'm enormously grateful, because I actually was thinking about this from the perspective of telecommunications, and kind of from a telecommunications background and history background, and it's nice to see that the antitrust and economics analysis works in the same way, and we reach pretty similar results from different avenues. But everybody focuses in on a couple of things. One, delivery through the internet solves one of the biggest problems traditionally associated with networks, which is the enormous expense of build-out. It's not cheap to build something as big and distributed and reliable as YouTube or Twitter, but the fact that you don't also have to build the last mile network out to the customer enormously reduces cost as compared to, say, the telegraph or cable systems or broadband. Number two, the multi-sided platform, which creates particularly strong network effects. What we generally mean by network effects are this idea that the more people are on the network, the more valuable it is. And most of us think this is a fairly straightforward relationship. But there are different types of networks. Some relationships are stronger than others. The fact that these platforms are capable of allowing people to perform multiple functions simultaneously, to self-organize into different groups, gives them a particular economic power and stickiness that goes beyond, say, cable television or other sorts of traditional network impacts. And finally, the fact that these businesses are able to control the information so that there's what I call perfect information asymmetry between the business and the consumer. You see the interface, you have no idea what lies behind the interface. That means that it is particularly difficult to identify when there is an issue. So the ability to quote, vote with your feet if you don't like a particular platform is virtually non-existent. The fact that we discovered that in 2016, Facebook was doing things with our personal data that we didn't like may make it so that in 2018 some people may leave, but the reality is you now have another 2 or 3 years of built-up investment in the platform. The platform is that much bigger, its network effects are that much more powerful, and there is simply no way that the market can respond to what's going on behind the curtain.
So typically, antitrust law looks at factors like market dominance, concentration, and you're proposing really a new metric, the cost of exclusion, which is really a fresh idea. Could you talk about that a little bit, explain that to us?
Yeah, one of the things that pretty much all of the competition reports that I've read agree with is the traditional metrics of antitrust have real problems with these digital platforms. Not just because we have narrowed and narrowed antitrust under the consumer welfare standards, sort of the general critique of antitrust and how it's gone in the last 40 years, but because they challenge a lot of the ideas. Antitrust assumes that the market generally works fine. There are bad actors who abuse their dominant position, and you go in and you remedy that problem, and you can isolate the issue to a particular geographic market usually, and identify a particular product market or service market. That's hard to do for a lot of these digital platforms. What is Facebook's market? Well, Facebook's market is Facebook. Google, we say, okay, Google is search, but it does a lot of additional things besides search that help to make it that much more sticky. We have, I am now broadcasting this over Twitter, the micro-blogging site that is now also apparently a do-it-yourself broadcaster. But Twitter is not the actual broadcaster in the broadcasting sense. If anything, it's like a cable access channel. But again, these things are not easily identified. So what I say is, let's look at the thing that everybody agrees gives the digital platform its power, this network effect. And particularly powerful sorts of network effects. And I borrowed a concept from telecommunications that was originally developed to describe the digital divide and explain why getting people on broadband networks was important, not just because once you are on, you enjoy a powerful advantage, but because as more people get on, the cost of not being on the network begins to rise exponentially. So I start with, it's an advantage to me. The more people get on, the more of an advantage is. Then you'll get a tipping point where the incremental advantage to me starts to level off. The difference between 300 million people on Twitter and 400 million people on Twitter in the United States who speak English is relatively minor. Whereas if you are a business trying to communicate to customers through Twitter, the more of your competitors who are on Twitter and the more of your customers who are on Twitter, the more it is a disadvantage to you not to be able to use that service. So what I've said is, okay, let's go to the root of the issue, where the market power here resides, which is not so much in any specific market share, but in the power of the network and the power to exclude people from the platform, and use that as the metric of market power.
So another piece of breaking news today that my organization, and let's shameless plug there, reported. The House of Representatives today approved an additional $40 million in funding for the Federal Trade Commission for enhanced competition and privacy enforcement, which is, I think we can all agree, probably good news. You're really proposing to create a new regulator. Why can't an existing agency such as the FTC do this job?
Well, as I point out in the book, you could go with the Federal Trade Commission and modify it. You'd have to change it in a way that would make it radically different from what it does now. The list of tools that it needs, and again, it's not just about antitrust. And again, so antitrust and privacy. Well, okay, privacy relates to some degree to antitrust, but they're different. And then it's antitrust, privacy, and content moderation. And antitrust, privacy, content moderation, and consumer protection of various types, and election regulation. So there's a lot of things in there that the FCC does not traditionally do, and you'd have to essentially create a whole new agency that would specialize in this particular sector of the economy in order to do the job right. You could go with something like the Federal Communications Commission, which is at least closer, but there are a lot of reasons why I wouldn't trust them, looking at you, Agent Pie. But in particular, because one of the critiques of agencies, which to some degree is true, is not so much capture in the sense of direct control, again, looking at you, Agent Pie, but the problem of the agency starts to think of things in a particular way. So one of the critiques of the FCC during the time when we regulated AT&T as a monopoly was it was too slow to introduce competition and was too solicitous of AT&T. Well, yeah, but that's because their mission for 50 years had been preserving the stability of the network and making sure that it was available to everybody at affordable rates, and that 911 or whatever we were using at the time in your area as the emergency phone number worked reliably. It was a very different way of looking at the world. So yeah, the FCC does a number of the things that we want to take a look at, and they have experience with networks, experience with some forms of these questions about content, but they have a very particular way of looking at things that I don't think is suitable for the new economy. What I'd like to see is for us to start fresh. I believe very strongly in the lessons of history. I believe that this isn't some magic black box that either we do nothing because it will anger the genie that lives in the black box and gives us these wonders, or we just tell people to do whatever the hell we want, and the black box will produce the right outcome because we just nerve hard enough you can take down terrorist content before it even gets posted. There is a thing there that we have to look at and respect. We need to be informed by the lessons of the past, but they shouldn't control what we're trying to do here. The values remain the same, but the rules have to be tailored to the specific sector of the economy.
So, just to defend Ajit Pai, he's an entertaining follow on Twitter, at least, so I don't know where he comes up with that stuff. Take us through your regulatory toolkit. This new federal platforms regulator, what will it be able to do? What tools will it have at its disposal? Just give us a quick rundown on that.
So what we would want to have is an agency that is empowered both in terms of economic competition policy. So there's a list of things that we look to as remedies that have worked. Interoperability, data portability, which is seen as being the same as telephone number portability. We get certain types of privacy protection, particularly for competitors on the platform, so that the platform can't use businesses that are using it as essentially a form of customer research and then leap in and take advantage of that as Amazon and some other platforms have been accused of doing. So we want to have this agency that's empowered to review mergers and look at the specifics of this in a way that antitrust agencies are not generally empowered to do, looking at whether they serve the public interest, not merely whether there is going to be a loss of competition. We need to have an agency that is frankly empowered to split up companies where appropriate. People do not realize just how critical the FCC was in both the original AT&T breakup and in maintaining the separate pieces for so many years. The internet that people seem to think, bloomed without any sort of government regulation was a direct result of several decisions of the FCC regulating the telephone network, saying, you've got to let rivals use your network. You can't discriminate in favor of your own products. In fact, we're not even going to let you get into these lines of business because if we did, you'd immediately monopolize the market. So we need all of that. But we can't forget the content side. We need to make sure that democracy is protected. And by that, I don't just mean ways in which we try to deal with fake news, but ways in which we address the problems of filter bubbles and what do we do to try to nudge people to have an interest, or at the very least, prevent algorithms from shepherding us unconsciously into filter bubbles that we would not seek out for ourselves. That's one of the biggest problems when you look at this, is not just, I only want conservative voices or I only want progressive voices. I can do that on TV today by just tuning into my favorite network that reflects my particular political view. The real danger is an algorithm that is trying to provide the most engaging content for us and ends up being like this invisible sheepdog that is moving us in a particular direction so that we do not have what Cass Sunstein has called an architecture of serendipity, the finding of things that we normally just would not find. So we need an agency that can look at that while being mindful and respectful of the First Amendment, while being mindful of freedom of expression. And finally, we need an agency that is capable of harnessing these platforms for public safety uses. I was on an advisory committee to FEMA for 2 years, and one of the big areas is the use of social media and other digital platforms for public safety. And that's not a euphemism for spying on people. I mean, like, actually tailored information about, when the county tweets out, here are the 5 places you can go if you need, if you've been evacuated because of a wildfire, and people are able to respond in real time to somebody and forward that message and retweet that message, that's a very powerful thing. And having an agency that helps to organize that and make sure that those capabilities continue to be built into platforms, while again, mindful of privacy and other concerns, is critically important.
So as a guy who's been covering the antitrust litigation against Apple for 7 years, and it's gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it's now back at the district court, where actually finally after 7 years starting to get to the meat of the dispute, I've always been incredibly frustrated about trying to use antitrust as a tool to regulate tech. And the thing I found really exciting about your approach is that you have elements of privacy law, privacy by design. We haven't even talked about intellectual property, but you're talking about free licensing of fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. And why is it so important to sort of break down those walls and to sort of take these what have been separate disciplines of antitrust, privacy, intellectual property, and sort of bring them together under one regulatory umbrella?
All of policy is going to be trade-offs. And the issue is not, are we going to be able to have perfect privacy, nor what that does to competition policy. Because perfect privacy has implications for competition privacy, and there are some trade-offs there. We're not going to be able to say interoperability, good or bad. That may be good for certain types of things, bad for the ability to disseminate harmful content. We need to be mindful of these trade-offs, and we need to do them in a rational way. We're never going to be perfect, but I am sick of hearing people talk about regulatory humility when what they mean is don't do anything. Because the decision not to act is a decision. And when you say, well, I'm afraid because it might have an unintended consequence, I'm like, okay, so you do your best in a complex system to try to figure out what those are going to be, and you have mechanisms for course correction. And the way you solve that is by not saying it's just an antitrust problem, or it's just a consumer protection problem. There is no such thing as pure consumer protection that exists in some platonic ideal. It is always going to be very specific to the nature of the industry, to the facts. When we look at some things where you say, yeah, fraud is bad. What role social media should have in taking down fraudulent things, especially when I don't think homeopathic medicine works. I think it's a fraud, but there are a lot of people out there who would be very upset if I got to say social media should treat all ads for homeopathic services as fraud, or all chiropractic as fraud. Whereas we pretty much will agree that, yeah, actual fraud where you're deceiving people, we should be doing something about that. But then we get to the harms that are unique to the sector. And we look at things like these dark design ideas where traditional antitrust is not going to help you out. The idea that, the fact that you've been trained by an industry that when something is highlighted, it means one thing, so I can trick you by making the opposite thing highlighted, is not something that antitrust pays attention to, but it is something that a sophisticated regulator can pay attention to. And that's why we need to combine all of these disciplines into one oversight agency.
Well, I'd like to open this up to questions. I think we have a mic that is going to make the rounds around the room. I certainly could ask some more questions, but I'm sure you guys have some great things to ask Carol.
Hey, Harold. So I'm on board. I'm with you. What is the legislative vehicle to make this happen over the next, say, 6, 12, 18 months?
So this is a big bite. And one of the things I point out in my book is, okay, we need to recognize that it took 4 tries before we got the Communications Act of 1934. And in the intervening approximately 25 years, actually 20 years, use cases changed, technology changed. It was an evolutionary process. So I think that we can get some things in motion. I think we certainly can get the framework in motion. I think that at the moment there is no vehicle because everyone in Congress is still thinking of these in their various silos. The fact that it took us this long to get people looking at just privacy and saying, well, maybe we actually should have some kind of federal privacy law, tells you something about the speed at which this moves. At the same time, I do think that we're seeing this be an election issue. We are seeing that people care about this. The more these things become embedded in our lives, and the more these things become embedded in commerce, the more people are looking to both the federal government and state governments for solutions. And bluntly, I have to say the thing that drove the companies and therefore certain members of Congress to be willing to talk about national privacy law in a serious way was California passed a strong privacy law. So while I'm not sold on the idea that every state needs to have its own comprehensive digital platform regulatory framework, I do have to say that one thing that would kick Congress in the pants is if we had a state like New York or California say, yeah, you know what, if you, the federal government, aren't going to do this, we're going to pass elements of this on our own. And the prospect of that kind of a patchwork would drive Congress to act in a much more serious way.
Thank you. So it makes sense when we have things like privacy and IP fall under like one bucket, under one department. But it seems like with certain tech companies out over here, right, it affects regulations in transportation, say, with rideshare companies. So I was curious as to your thoughts on where the limits of this one regulatory body, whether it extends to like transportation companies or whether it extends to hospitality. So I was curious as to your thoughts about that.
It's an excellent question, because what I'd like to say, for example, with the Federal Communications Commission or the Food and Drug Administration is you have specialized agencies whose authority is narrow but deep, meaning they have what, at least on the surface of the statute, look like really extraordinary powers. But those are tolerable because they address a fairly narrow area of commerce. It's important. I mean, the FCC deals with multi-billion-dollar industries that are at the heart of our national information infrastructure. But at the end of the day, their powers are tolerable because they do not regulate everything that connects to that infrastructure. They just regulate the infrastructure. So, on the other hand, we do have a lot of cases where you have multiple agency overlap. Banks, for example, you have certain types of food and drug advertising is regulated by both the FDA and the FTC. So I do think there is room for overlap. What I'd like to see is the digital authority address the uniquely platform issues. And we see this in other specialized areas too. When Walgreens is regulated as a pharmacy, they're regulated by the FDA and the Drug Enforcement Agency, but when they're regulated locally around things like zoning or if their prices are deceptively advertised or whatever, they're regulated by state consumer protection law and the FTC. I think we can do the same thing for folks like Airbnb or Uber, where we say, yeah, elements that are in this platform wheelhouse, the things that make you part of this sector should be addressed by the digital authority. Whereas whether you're violating local laws about rental housing or you're discriminating against people based on race or sexual orientation, we can leave those with the same agencies that have investigated them until now.
I wanted to ask a question about what you thought of the European approach, I guess, what you're saying, where I think we've been able to regulate a lot of the problems that you mentioned in a siloed way, I suppose. So we've done privacy, we're doing now platform regulation, we're looking at updating our version of Section 230, we're doing antitrust, we're doing without creating this overarching authority. So I was interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, it's interesting because from what I can tell, there's a lot of debate about this, and the UK competition report by Jason Furman, but it was led by Jason Furman, I should say, he didn't write the whole thing, but it's often referred to as the Furman report, recommended creation of, if not a single regulator, at least a coordinating agency that would make sure that everything that happened got sent to the right agency, which to my mind means 10 years from now will be an agency. Because one of the problems is precisely this: you don't want the things falling between the cracks. It helps to have general oversight. I think that it's important to see different models out there. I have to say, I have been impressed with a lot of what the EU has done in antitrust, and I have found what it has done in copyright directive and content moderation to be frightening. But not just because if it were implemented, it would crash everything, but because therefore it will never be implemented. Example, UK porn block. For those who are not familiar with this, UK passed a law a couple of years ago that said you cannot make pornography online available to folks without age verification. And that age verification has to be protective of people's privacy, cannot involve credit card, and must magically be able to tell everybody's age whenever they log in, and you can't just take their word for it. It has now been delayed for the third time, this time indefinitely, because there is no way to do this. And, when you tell people there was no way to do that, they were like, oh, you just don't want to do it. But you get closer to it, it's like, no, there's actually no way to do this. Bad laws are bad not just because if you implemented them they'd be catastrophic, but because they are an unimplementable distraction. So I look to things like the copyright directive or some of the things that are being batted around, like taking down designated terrorist content in a time frame that is just ridiculous, and I say, all right, not only is that never going to happen and it's a waste of time, it's going to be an investment of a lot of money and effort in policies that are just not implementable, which will either lead to very uneven implementation in ways, or where we just abandon the effort and have to start again 2 years from now. On the other hand, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe you can make people do this. So, that's why it's important for geographic regions to sovereign nations to create laws that they feel implement their values. I'm just glad better you than me.
But would a single regulator fix that, I guess?
I think a single regulator is better at this kind of thing because they have a great deal of expertise. The efficiency of where you refer within the agency is better. So, at the FCC, maybe something goes to the Media Bureau or something goes to the Wireless Bureau, but, if it has to do with Comcast, that whether it's going to the the Wireline Competition Bureau or the Media Bureau, it's at least going to be handled by the FCC. And if it's an important issue, the people who are running the agency are able to stay on top of it. Plus, there is this trade-off. So you say, okay, I need to be able to take care of content that is harmful to people. I have to balance that against free expression. I have to balance that against technical feasibility. It is much easier to make that balancing in an agency that is a sector-specific regulator than it is among multiple agencies. At least that's been our experience here in the United States, and the financial collapse is actually been pointed to as one of the places where multiple agencies got played against each other.
Hi. Like what you're saying, I'm super supportive in general, but I feel like I haven't heard too much about advertising, and that seems to me to be where a lot of the money and power of these networks come from. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, yeah, I think addressing the advertising issues is one of the things that a sector regulator will be able to do in a sophisticated way. I think that, first of all, and I argued with the FCC a lot about this during the privacy rulemaking, it's not just advertising. Just on my little axis to grind, it turns out that some of the real-time geographic location data that one of the carriers sold to bounty hunters was directly responsible for a shootout by bounty hunters at a Texas used car dealership that killed a couple of people. Oopsie. It turns out that there are reasons we have very strict rules around this. But my point there is the personal information stuff is not just about advertising, even though people mostly conceptualize it at the moment as advertising. Again, a sophisticated agency regulator will be able to examine that. But I do think with regard to advertising itself, number one, I don't believe that we need the level of information for targeted advertising in order to provide free services. I understand the rationale is that you can extract a higher premium, but when you dig right down to it, there isn't a lot of evidence showing that you get significantly better results from these highly targeted ads. In fact, the best results you got, under one study I got, was when people knew the ads were being targeted at them because it made them feel like the ad had been curated to be directed at them. So if we tell people they're targeted ads, but they're not, we may achieve better results. Again, though, this is also a place where I feel society can and should set limits. Where it's like, yeah, I don't care if targeted ads work better. The fact that we think that it's wrong for you to be able to exploit people in a moment of weakness by calculating the moment when they are most vulnerable to particular appeals is a societal judgment, and it's one that we should take seriously.
Yeah, I have a question about just PR in general, because I saw Facebook use this line recently, and I thought it was kind of compelling about using, arguing against any legislation because of what China's done with their internet. And any thoughts on that? And also just unique problems that these kind of legislations face generally, because a lot of the public discourse happens on the very networks you're trying to regulate.
Well, at least Facebook didn't claim that we shouldn't be regulated because otherwise we'd lose the 5G race. Because really, but my point is that people will make all kinds of statements. And part of the problem is that companies aren't always lying. Sometimes they actually have a good point. So you can't just casually disregard. But some of these things, like, well, we wouldn't want to do it because, that would give you the same capacity that, China has. I'm like, yeah, but no. The answer to that is you build safeguards into the system, or you avoid certain sorts of centralized filtering that would give a government the ability to do this sort of thing. Because I do agree that there are problems with some of these where anytime you start to make a content moderation system or a tracking system or any of these, NSA and the rest will sneak up and say, hey, would you put a backdoor in for us? We promise not to abuse it. History shows that every time that happens, sure enough, it gets abused. So, yeah, there are issues, but the consequence of that is to create safeguards. The FCC, for better or worse, we did a lot of things to protect our infrastructure regulator from the kind of direct abuse that you see in a lot of other countries where it's directly incorporated into the executive. We don't appreciate how much having the Federal Trade Commission or the FCC or the FDA be independent agencies. But the fact that Donald Trump can't just yank somebody's license or can't do what, say, Erdogan does in Turkey, which is every time there's a broadcaster that's critical of him, suddenly there's an audit team there to discover that they have all of these infractions and they suddenly owe 2 billion lira. So there are some legitimate concerns, but the answer is to build in democratic safeguards and oversight, not to just throw up our hands.
Mike, I think this is the last question, and we're going to go to our second part, our part two.
Hey, Harold, I have a demographics question for you. So,
Hi, a person I've never seen before who knows about my obsession with demographics.
So I've seen you observe in other contexts that we are at sort of a generational shift in our current political landscape. And you seem to be trying to fuse together with your argument here, understanding the nuance of both the promise and the peril of these platforms that present to us as a society, and bring at the same time, the wisdom of the ancient past of both your past experience with media policy and things like public access television that a newer generation may not be familiar with changes in the media landscape. So my question for you, Harold, is are you too early or are you too late? Basically, are you just
I like to think I'm just in time. One of the things actually that's been a sore point for me for a large number of years has been precisely this generational divide and the tendency of folks on either side of it to dismiss the other generation and, with contempt, to put it mildly. I've been reading Senator Tufekci's Twitter and Tear Gas, which I recommend to everybody, by the way. And one of the things she points out is that one of the reasons why social media snuck in under the radar of many countries was because the people running the countries just couldn't imagine why this was significant. They bought into the whole slacktivism disregard of what organizing online was. By the same token, I also see people in the internet generation who fail to understand that one of the reasons why politics is the way it is because of traditional media. And the way that industry is structured, and that bluntly, you're going to have 30% of people believing, or 40% of people, whatever it is, believing that global warming is a Chinese hoax because they listen to Rush and they listen to talk radio. And all the Facebook in the world doesn't matter to them. So I do think that it's important to bridge that. Frankly, as somebody who's Gen X and therefore ignored on both sides of the demographic snake, I feel quite at home in that position. But yeah, I do think that it's important for people to realize on each side of the demographic line what the other really has to offer in terms of lessons.
Well, Harold, this has been great. Thanks so much. I think you have a really fresh idea. It's a sort of a new point of view, and I hope it gets a lot of attention. I'm going to be watching for sure. So thank you.
Thank you.
Harold, Mike, thank you so much. I work in the same office as Harold, and every day he does what he just did here for you guys, and he always has a reference that I have to go read. So thank you, Harold. Thank you, Mike, for helping us with that conversation. I'm going to ask our part two panel to come up front. All of you guys can make your way to the front and grab a seat. We've got about 45 minutes. Check my clock. We've got about 45 minutes left here in the event, but we wanted to have a reaction panel up here because, as I said at the beginning, as our panel is up here, it's really important to us in public knowledge that this be the beginning of a conversation that we want to happen in public. We really hope that these ideas around an expert digital agency are taken seriously by policymakers. We hope that Congress will look at it. But it doesn't mean it's the only idea out there, and certainly it's important that as policy is made that all stakeholders are at the table. And so we've got an interesting mix of folks here who are going to help us engage in a bit more of a conversation. And we will come back out to the audience for more questions for them. So keep thinking of things that you want to ask. But I'm going to help moderate this. And thank you guys for coming and participating in this today. I'm going to introduce our group here going down the line. First, to my immediate right, we're very fortunate to have, we promoted Leslie coming from Google, but Leslie couldn't make today, and on short notice, Jess Hemmerly, who is the Public Policy and Government Affairs Manager at Google, is with us. Thank you for coming, Jess. To her right, we had Mitch Stoltz, who's Senior Staff Attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, an advocacy group that we work with very often. So thank you for being here, Mitch. They're based here in San Francisco. To his right, we have Dina Srivastava, who is an antitrust scholar and an author, and just moved to the San Francisco area. So we're glad that she's here to participate. To her right, we have Andy O'Connell, who is Public Policy Director, Head of Content Distribution, Algorithm Policy at Facebook. Andy, with the prize for the longest title here on the panel. Congratulations. No, really, Andy, thank you for coming. We appreciate that you're willing to come and participate with us, bring your expertise. And then on the extreme end of the panel here, we have our very good friend from Mozilla, who is a sponsor of the event, our old friend Chris Riley, who is Director of Public Policy at Mozilla. So Chris, thank you for being here. Thank you for your help with the event. So folks, what I want to do to start off this conversation is kind of go down the line and ask folks, because I know, Harold's ebook, which folks have read and checked out and heard the conversation beforehand, is wide-ranging. It has this overarching idea of a digital agency, an expert agency, an expert regulator, but it also has a whole suite of ideas for conversation and debate for regulatory fixes, and it crosses content moderation, crosses competition issues. So I was hoping each of you could maybe take a minute to just share, is there one major piece of Harold's proposal, Harold's book, that really stood out to you that you thought that's really strong, that's really important, I agree with that? And also, is there one that you're like, I'm not so sure about that, and we'd love to hear what that concern might be. So why don't I start with you, Jess, since you're right next to me. Make sure the mic is on, and I'll let you take it from there. There we go.
And I apologize that I need to slip out early, so do that as awkwardly as I So I think in terms of, thank you, by the way, for inviting us and having me step in for Vice President last minute. I think one of the things that we certainly, we appreciate a lot of the ideas in Harold's book for sure. I think one of the things that we find to be really the most valuable contribution to conversation is the idea of multifaceted approaches. So looking at sort of a suite of tools to manage and address the issues at hand that are raised by digital platforms. I think that's definitely from privacy by design to sort of looking at the antitrust piece to looking at codes of practice and toolkits and things like that. There are really diverse issues involved here, and they require a diverse suite of tools to address them. And so we definitely appreciate that. I think that in terms of something for conversation, we could get into the nitty-gritty of the definition of digital platform to start. I think that in itself raises questions and just sort of the idea of creating a new regulatory body rather than empowering our existing regulatory bodies to have sort of the knowledge and the expertise to address digital platforms, given that digital platforms are an increasing part of every industry. And so I think that's kind of where we'd start.
Thanks, and thanks to Cullen College for hosting this, and thank you very much, Harold. You're both the fiction speaker and the cameraman, so this is a really welcome contribution to heated and very sort of fractious set of conversations going on right now, and to take a step back from each of these individual issues and say, what does the big picture look like is a key piece that was really missing. What resonated with me the most was the focus on interoperability as, I think, and seems to do too, a more pressing conversation than breakups. Not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it gets us to solving a lot of the problems that we're seeing potentially, and drawing on some really successful models of communications networks and technology from the past that have been federated models where the rules and policies can be set by a multitude of actors to which users can choose among, but they can still communicate with one another in a larger network. And it's a good observation, I think, that doing that probably requires an First Amendment, but beyond the First Amendment, the American tradition, I would say, is that the government or agencies of the government don't decide what is good and bad content. And it's not as if we have a problem. We have a problem, but proposing agents, an agency, or even a sort of a new set of laws about or regulations about what's considered bad content is kind of a Pandora's box. It's not necessarily part of the same problem. Both the problems of bigness and the problems of bad content are very interrelated, but they are not necessarily one problem with one set of solutions.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here. That was, you said what I was going to say next. I think on interoperability, it's interesting because we can also look at some of these tech platforms that were much more interoperable in their rise to power and are much less interoperable today. For example, Facebook Messenger used to be interoperable with ICQ. You used to be able to compose a tweet on Twitter and have that cross-post to your Facebook newsfeed. And so there's been a clawing back of interoperability, and this is very natural behavior in natural monopoly markets. But counteracting that through imposition of interoperability would introduce some form of competition in the market. So, and since they are lessons of history, we have them in the toolbox, and they're very easy to use. One thing I might add is I think that today, when we're talking about these tech platforms, we're really talking 80-90% of the time about Facebook and Google. And Facebook made about 99% of its revenues from digital advertising last year. Google made 90% of its top line from digital advertising revenues last year. And all of those ads are traded in programmatic RTB auction environments. And the number one input in those auction environments that drives pricing is user identification and user data. So I think it's crucial right now, especially as we have sort of pending investigations and at the sort of federal and state levels and in Congress, that we talk more about user identification, user data, and cookies in digital advertising.
Thank you. So a thing we like most and a thing we might take issue with. So I think at its core, what I appreciate most about Harold's work is the recognition that private sector companies are making a lot of decisions that feel like governmental decisions, and that we need to wrestle with that as a society, and government has a role in wrestling with those issues. So at Facebook, there are 4 areas in particular where we've been pushing for smart regulation. The first is harmful content. That's the issue that I work most closely on. I'll probably talk more about it tonight. The second is privacy regulation, which we've talked about quite a bit. The third is election protection, election integrity, and the final one is data portability. We think those are themes certainly in the book, but they're issues that we think are incredibly important in terms of just values, political trade-offs that companies are forced to make at this point, but that that governments and society ought to be playing a more direct role in. And I guess that's the transition to the thing I might take issue with, which is sort of the focus on a single agency. And I think for me, it's probably more a question of just practicality. We find ourselves in a position where we have to make these decisions, and we can't afford to wait for governments to come to the table and make these decisions. An example of that would be like the Honest Ads Act in the context of election interference. We can't wait for Congress to pass this sort of regulation, and so we're working to implement it already. And so we're taking the initiative in a lot of these spaces, but we want government to be involved and take a bigger stand, and it's not clear to me that we can
Thanks. So we've gone through everyone already. My name's Chris, so just for clarity. I'm also going to cheat and probably talk about more than one thing in each category, but I promise I'll keep them short. The first one is very short. This is definitely the most pro-interoperability crowd that I've seen in a while. Like, I've been talking about the importance of interoperability in the context of competition for like 2 years now. So I'm clearly in very favorable territory. I love seeing that in the book. I love seeing that starting to be teased, so without that term in the Furman report, and then the European Commission experts report sent to Commission Investors, which took that concept even further, and then the recent Chicago School of Business report that PK CEO G. Kimmelman was involved with, led by Scott Morton, took that concept of interoperability even further. So like these all came out in the past 3 months, by the way. So I would say the timing of this book is very well aligned with how competition review is shaping all around the world. Like others on this panel, I'm not sure that the one regulator model is the one that we're going to end up in. I'm very glad that we put it out there because it's time to have a conversation about how we do governance here. I think we're going to increasingly find ourselves in a situation where we don't want governments making a lot of the decisions. We don't want companies making a lot of the decisions. We know we can't just leave it to users either because we see a lot of problems online with the lack of anyone making a decision or being clear. So we're going to have to figure out some sort of long-term way for the voices and the forces of users, governments, and corporations and corporate norms and corporate cultures to all come together here. And I can't tell you what that's going to be. I don't think anyone can right now. So I'm glad that we're pushing it and pushing to see where the conversation takes us.
Okay. So let's pick out a few topics here from the many that are in the book. And maybe we'll start with the one that got mentioned the most here. So interoperability as a concept, it sounds like there's a lot of positive feeling about moving towards interoperability, or as you said, moving back towards greater interoperability. Are there barriers or are there challenges that you guys anticipate to getting to greater interoperability across different platforms? And you know, how do you see an expert agency maybe wrestling with that and helping or working with that?
Well, one obvious problem is privacy. Interoperability, in a sense, is what gives the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and there's always going to be a bit of a trade-off there. The other input to that trade-off is informed consent, user input. How does one know who the data is going to, who it's shared with, and what the intentions of those third parties are? So that hopefully is a question for some comprehensive privacy regulation, which has to be part of this mix. But it also has to be part of the interoperability conversation. The reason why I think that needs to be with why an expert agency would be useful on that is because of what happened to the local phone companies after the 1996 Act, where unbundling was mandated, interoperability with the incumbent long-distance network mandated, and yet their service calls were answered a little bit slowly. Things didn't work quite as well for the new phone companies as for the incumbent ones. And add all of those up and put the vast majority of them out of business. That's the sort of thing I think an agency could address.
And that was Chris.
Yeah, I mean, so interoperability in the digital platform context occurs via APIs or application programming interfaces. I probably don't need to explain that concept to this room, but I spent a lot of time explaining it to competition regulators around the world over the past year or so. I think it's going to be hard. It's going to be important for someone in government to be able to look at specific changes by platforms to their APIs and make a call. Was the deprecation or the shutting down of this API made in the normal course of evolving technology and business? Was it made as Facebook's changed to Graph 1.0 API was and when it Cambridge Analytica, like in reaction to a privacy or security concern? And even if it was made in reaction to a privacy and security concern, was it made right? Was it done in a calibrated way, or was the string typed a little bit too much? And now interoperability was not allowed to continue when it could have been, while still protecting the underlying privacy and security concerns. So there's a really fine-grained, really context-specific process that needs to be gone through by a regulator with the capacity, the technical capacity, scales of resources to be able to look at what's going on, what the company did, and measure that against a set of predictable principles to try to give some clarity and guidance to the company so that they know how to behave in a good or competitive movement too. It's going to be hard, but it's important that we start talking about it now and that we start getting the resources in place and the principles in place so that we can do this predictably and right.
And just to follow up on that, what Chris is saying is basically these problems were solved, and they were solved through APIs that existed, and were used to accomplish this very hard task that we think is going to be so hard to implement, but that the functionality was, again, shut down. So.
I feel like I was thinking a little abstractly. So just if you think about it in the context of Facebook, I think there's no question that you own your own data on Facebook. You own what you post, what you say, what information you disclose. Where it gets tricky is when it's information that your friends have shared with you. So Chris and I are friends on Facebook. I actually think we are friends on Facebook.
We are friends on Facebook.
So he shares with me a post, or he shares with me his birthday, or he shares with me where he works. If we're thinking about being able to take your data as Andy to a different platform or to interoperate with another platform, what do we do with Chris's data that he has shared with me? Which, at least in the context of Facebook, it's Chris's data that makes my experience on Facebook, or all of the Chris's, all the people I'm friends with, that make the experience on Facebook valuable. And that's where it gets hard. The idea that I own my data, I think, is uncontroversial, but where do we draw the line with other people's data when they share it with me? That's where it gets really hard, and I agree with everybody else. Like, that is where governments need to step up and help draw those lines.
A topic I wanted to bring up that was discussed in Harold's book, but was not discussed. He didn't really flesh it out in his conversation about content moderation here up on stage. Was Harold's book had a full-throated defense of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and there's a lot of talk in Washington right now about scrapping that law over concerns of allowing platforms to let harmful content online, illegal content online. I'm curious what folks think about that law and its utility, but also the critiques out there that it is harmful, and are there ways that it should be modified? Who wants to go first? Yeah.
I'm happy to go first.
Okay.
Well, to borrow some of Andy's contextualization from the last question, let's not talk about this in a vacuum. It's about specific laws and proposals and things that come up in the context of Section 230, right? We worked on SESA FOSA last year, the bills in Congress. I won't bother giving the acronym. They were related to limiting the safe harbor under Section 230 in the context of sex trafficking and sex trafficking crime. We were extremely concerned, particularly about the early versions of those bills, as I think were most people in California, because of the ways in which they went about solving this problem, because of the lack of a clear necessity to make this kind of change in the law to achieve the goal that was being set up by the governments. I think there were a lot of concerning elements of that. So, like, we would from my team's position, so when, not if, when the next bill to scale back Section 230 gets introduced, we're going to need to look at that and try to understand why. We will almost certainly sympathize with the problem because these aren't coming from nothing. This is, well, it's not exclusively, at least, driven by a willful and intentional desire to punish means. It's driven in large part because there's a lot of stuff online that's awful. Like, the internet is not healthy right now. We've talked about that a lot in the civil context through our Internet Health Report publication, Internet Health Report, I'm pretty sure it's already brought forward. So we share the concerns that are motivating the attempts in the U.S. to do more about unwanted content online. We share the concern that's motivating European politicians to look at reopening the e-commerce directive, something that's almost certainly going to happen in the next year or so. Doesn't mean that you actually need to change 230 or the e-commerce directive in order to achieve the goal of making the internet healthier.
Obviously, but Google, we are data about what actually is happening on our platforms, what kinds of things are we removing, what kinds of things are we not removing, what is the scale? And I think, again, the scale of the problem is obviously, I don't need to lecture this room about the difficulty in trying to proactively monitor content of all types as it goes up, or the potential free speech issues with proactively monitoring people's content and censoring it. But the more that we as an industry can put data out there that helps people to understand the complexity and the scope of content that's on our services and the ways that we enforce our own content policies and removals and things like that, I think the better we can all kind of come together to talk about what are we actually trying to solve for, what are the real ultimate, what are some solutions, and are we doing, how bad of a job are we doing, or how good of a job are we doing? I think again, it's I work on the transparency report, which is why I'm obviously kind of obsessed with this. But the YouTube community guidelines report, I think, is a huge first step for us as a company in terms of providing data on our own decisions about content removal. And I think that the more we can do things like that, and the more other companies can do things like that, the more we can better understand really the effect of and the scope and the scale of content like this on our services, and we can inform these conversations in a way that we don't need to pull back safe harbors, but maybe we can create really specific laws tailored to the specific types of content that are deemed as problematic.
I'm often sort of mystified by these conversations about our platforms, publishers, why would you make your publisher? And I've come to realize that at its core, when people and particularly media folks are raising these issues, what they're really getting at is this question of responsibility, and is there a sense that companies are responsible for moderating the content on the platform? And I think an important part of Harold's contribution is clearing up some of the confusion about that and reminding people that CDA 230 is what allows internet platforms to moderate and to take that responsibility. It's both a shield and a sword, enabling companies to sort of take on that task when prior to CDA 230 that created liability. And so I think that's an important contribution.
Mitch, I mean, we're just works on the transparency report at Google, and they're collecting all sorts of information about moderation. Andy over there works with the oversight boards. It's been referred to in the press as like the Supreme Court for decisions around content moderation. You had concerns about the government getting involved with making some of these decisions that was proposed in Harold's book. I think he had kind of a hybrid government involvement, but also private sector self-regulation with some standards. I mean, where do we draw that line about the government's involvement in deciding what we need to track, what we need to know about these content moderation decisions?
Actually, I think mandates on transparency are a great idea. This is something FF, my organization, has pushed for a long time now, and we applaud the expansion of the transparency among the major platforms. So that doesn't raise the same sort of speech concerns as a government policy. That's a really, really positive one. On the Section 230 point, most current concerns, terrorist recruitment, radicalization, fake news, to some degree harassment, most of these are not things that are legally actionable in the U.S. and probably shouldn't be. So whether or not the Section 230 is preventing litigation that doesn't really exist anyway is maybe a direct question. This is well covered in Harold's book, and I think it's an important point. There is just so much misinformation and misconception around this law and what it does. Really, Section 230 represents what is different about the internet as compared to earlier communications networks. And without it, basically, I think the internet becomes something that looks a lot like cable TV. It becomes a feud of vanity.
say that because we've been talking about privacy policies and what being good at privacy as a tech company means for a long time. We have been talking about what it means to be good and to be responsible in the content moderation context for 3 years, less, a much shorter time. So I think we have a lot more to do to map out the theme of responsibility. I also like very much. I think it's a very important contribution in addition to this. But we've got a long ways to go before we really have a shared vision of what that looks like. So one of the things the European Commission, the outbound European Commission did that I like to point to a lot is the way they handle disinformation, not misinformation, but disinformation, the willful generation of false misleading information online. The European Commission did not do a thing that one might think the European Commission would do, which is introduce a law that says you're not allowed to publish disinformation. Instead, they set up this process. They set up a process where the European Commission basically breathed down on top of a group of big companies and said, what can you do to make this problem better? And through a lot of pressure, a lot of sort of Damocles style hanging there, companies made real commitments last year. And now Mozilla has made some quibbles about how some of those commitments have been executed, which I won't get into here. The process was a really, I think, inspiring one. Like, knowing that we don't know how to write a law today that says don't have misinformation online, what can we do? And I think some really, really good progress is made. And I think there's probably a lot we can do in the content space to get in that same positive direction.
So we're going to go to questions from the audience in a second. I wanted to ask one more question, and I think I'll go to Dina with it. But if you have a question, since I'm up here and not playing over out in the audience like I was in part one, there's a microphone right here, so just come on up to the microphone and we'll turn to you and you can ask it. But so as folks come up, Dina, you're our antitrust expert here. We have folks who deal with content moderation, but there was there's a clear line in the sand, I think, in Harold's presentation about, well, antitrust definitely cannot deal with these content moderation issues, and I think it's one of the strongest arguments for a digital platform. I say that being someone who works in public knowledge and works with Harold, so I'm agreeing with them. But as we look at the power of antitrust law, I'd love to get your take on what you think antitrust can and cannot do when it comes to some of these competition concerns that were raised. And especially looking at, as new business streams are rolled out by companies, how do we decide when they've crossed the line where something isn't competitive or a new vertical or a new merger is harmful? How do we deal with those sorts of questions?
Okay.
That was a lot.
I know that was a lot.
Sorry.
So.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the content then. I guess I'm going to push back generally and say that, well, sort of, competition is, I would argue, the most effective tool to make sure that the free market is outputting goods and services that consumers like, right? So competition is a very important tool in the toolbox, and if we don't have it, we should correct that problem so that we make sure we have people competing with these digital platforms. And once we have competition and we have different platforms, we might solve a lot of these problems that we're talking about, even on the content side. Digital advertisers don't have transparency into a lot of the process, and you as a user, you don't have optionality in terms of, you don't have a lot of optionality in terms of changing the algorithms, the way the content is displayed to you. There's no mechanism for you to go back and sort of look at all the ads that were targeted to you and then actually understand why they were targeted to you, right? So we will solve a lot of these problems, including the content problems, with competition.
We have a question from the audience, and please, others, feel free to step up in line here. Tell us who you are.
My name is Chris Whitman. I've very interested in the discussion on interoperability because I have spent the better part of my career litigating telecom interconnection cases. And so I was very interested to hear you, Chris, say someone is going to have to look at specific changes to APIs, whether they are being done in a calculated way, and measure that against a set of predictable principles or a set of principles. My question is, how does that happen in internet time? The interconnection cases that I've been involved with have gone 2, 3, 4 years or more.
Yeah, well, if it takes 4 years, it's not going to be a very effective regulatory mechanism. I certainly would agree with that. I mean, in practice, one of the things that does happen is companies give a fair bit of notice before changing their APIs because developers do rely on them and build a lot of things dependent on them. So if you have a 6-month window and a company announces a change to its APIs, you have potentially a sufficient window of time there for the extra $40 million that the Federal Trade Commission is getting if they hire a bunch more technologists with that, because they frankly don't have nearly enough on staff right now, to have a conversation with that company, and they can have a pretty lightweight first pass to get a sense of the rationale for it and the consequences of it. Maybe talk to a couple of other people who if someone brings a complaint to the agency and say, hey, this is really messing me up, the agency can say, is it really messing you up, or do you just have to change your code a little bit and you can work with the new structure? I think it can be done. I think that's why an expert agency is the right body to do it. If this goes to a court system, I don't see how you can have a litigation-led process work fast enough with something this technical and this sensitive.
But you're going to have appeal rights.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Process from.
Yeah, no, well, you can, but I mean, if you're in that situation, sorry, the follow-up was you have to have appeal rights. If you're in that situation, you can at the very least get stays on changes. I mean, it gets a little complicated, and even I'm sure Mitch probably get a little uncomfortable with the idea of more specific intervention into how companies set up their APIs and so forth. But like, if it's an anti-competitive act, it's an anti-competitive act. You have to do what you have to do.
Please, yeah.
Hi, this question is for Andy. I think I heard you say earlier that people on Facebook own their own data. And I want to know, how can you say it with a straight face after everything that's happened? Or is Facebook defining ownership in some other way that most people would not be familiar with? Because I think of ownership as meaning you have control. And if data that is on Facebook ends up in Cambridge, England, on some other server not controlled by Facebook, and you don't even know that it happened, how does that comport with ownership?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a fair question, and I think the Cambridge Analytica scandal was certainly a breach of trust by Facebook and by our developer partners. And it happened, as I think Harold mentioned, back in 2015, and subsequent to that, actually immediately following that and prior to this becoming public, we made a number of changes to lock down our APIs to prevent things like that from happening. I think at the principles level, though, the idea that stuff you put on Facebook, you should be able to take where you want to take it, is something we've tried to embody for a long time. You can already download all of your information on Facebook. We joined the Data Transfer Project to really sort through some of these questions about what you do with sort of the Chris data that he has shared with me. But there does need to be a regulatory component to that to sort through some of these harder questions.
Please, yeah, come on up to the microphone. I saw hands raising.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So more on this interoperability debate, I think it was interesting when Facebook actually announced that they were considering making WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Instagram more interoperable. I think some antitrust regulators said, ooh, actually that's not going to help competition because you're consolidating across one company. And so I wonder whether we think that there is something to be done in terms of merger control and saying maybe Facebook should not have been allowed to acquire WhatsApp, and in the future should prevent any of these companies from acquiring anyone in a sort of related sector, I guess.
I feel like I've been talking a little bit too much, but this is a softball floating my way, so I apologize. I wrote but under the condition that any integrations of data or functionality between two companies were implemented through APIs that were offered to third parties on reasonable terms. So if you imagine that the interoperable future, it I think gets at a lot of these things. I also was not particularly kind after the WhatsApp iMessage thing, and I believe I called it the new walled garden or something rather stark like that, because it is not in fact interoperable to have your own services just to be able to talk with each other in the context of messaging, a service that could in fact be so much more truly interoperable. Messaging is a hard one. Like we want to support an environment for innovation, for growth and development. The messaging protocols, there are a lot of different standards out there, but it's certainly from my perspective, when you can, you want to push for standards-based protocols so that different services can communicate with each other. You want to permit interoperability so that you can design services to function with each other even beyond what you can do with standards. I mean, once these services are already inside Facebook, a policy change that gets made, it's obviously tougher to do anything about that at that point in time, but certainly, I don't think that was the best shining example of interoperability.
And on the merger front, I mean, I'm sure the mergers are sort of in the process of getting reevaluated, and if there's, we could find a violation of antitrust law there, and it's possible that the mergers are undone.
So
it's not out of the realm of possibility.
So with these, as folks are looking at, there's all kinds of reports in the paper about antitrust agencies, antitrust enforcers looking at Facebook, looking at other companies. There was this conversation in Harold's discussion around the importance of having dual agency responsibility, so that in the same way that the FCC partners with the DOJ in telecommunications mergers, that an extra agency could also put the sort of conditions on that Chris was talking about. But they can also look and see if, in addition to those conditions, if there needs to be sector-wide rules around interoperability. I mean, to me, that's the strength of this argument for a digital agency, that it can move quicker and faster than just the enforcement of the antitrust officials. So, I mean, is there any disagreement with that idea that having dual agencies with dual jurisdictions is a problem, or is it just an added benefit like I said? No. If not, I can go back to that question over here. Yeah.
I don't think it's a problem to have different agencies handling different aspects. Again, I actually, while it's useful to think of digital platforms as a sector of the economy with a unique set of problems, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of those problems are going to be solved through the same mechanisms or the same agency. On your example of merger conditions, merger conditions are actually a little bit troublesome because they're one-offs and because they tend to be time limited. Often, I think ex-ante rules of conduct are going to be a better way to go than rules enforced through merger conditions applied to a particular merger, usually for 5, 10, 7, 10 years after that merger.
Question, yes.
So, one question I have for each of you is that leaving bad faith concerns aside, what is different about the landscape now that's saying we'll just wait for competition to magically arrive and sweep these companies away in the way that they swept away the companies that were before them? Before Facebook, there was MySpace. Before Google, there was Excite, a whole bunch of other websites that weren't alive in the 90s and never heard of. So what is different now that's waiting for things to resolve themselves as all this happened before, supposedly? What's different now? Why do we need some sort of intervention at some level to fix things?
I think we had a period of time where we haven't seen disruption, right? So in the social network case, there was very strong competition for the first 6-7 years on the market, and then the growth trends just shifted, and one company sort of your long-term sort of evaluation of the market, that the free market is eventually going to come in and, wipe sort of the slate clean, but we're just trying to fix those numbers, that period of time.
Also, many of those shifts that you referred to were aided by some major antitrust cases. So, not MySpace and Facebook, but the U.S. versus Microsoft case arguably created room for the rise of Google, Facebook, and so on. That doing things that may have been absorbed into Microsoft, don't realize it. And then folks within Microsoft are going to quote it and say that was probably true. It was because they had a cop in the elbow, to use Tim Wolf's phrase. And then before that, AT&T, there was a record with AT&T arguably directly to the commercial internet.
So can I suggest, Chris, I definitely want to jump in. Please.
Do you want to jump in on that? I do think that things are different now than they have been in the past. Not everyone might agree with that, but I feel very strongly that they're different. There are a lot of different dimensions to that. One is to the company's credit. They pump a lot of money into R&D and into growing and adapting and evolving their services. They also often, and Apple did this very notably with the iPad when it came out, they're willing to cannibalize themselves sometimes up to a degree in order to get ahead of what would have been the next disruptive player in the market. In a brief, misguided earlier phase of my life, went on the job teaching market to be a law professor, and my job talk paper was an argument that the theory of disruptive innovation essentially died in the internet context because of companies' ability to control the intersection points, which I think is the sort of technical version of the economic version that says market entry costs are a lot higher than we assume them to be because you need to get to a certain critical mass of data and network effects in order to really have scale to make a difference on your own when you can live on top of or work with the existing platforms that be. So there's a lot of different factors that go into this, but I definitely believe it's different.
So I'm not actually as convinced that it's fundamentally different. I mean, if you think about Facebook, if you think about messaging, Facebook doesn't lead in messaging. If you think about photo sharing or video sharing, Facebook doesn't necessarily lead in any of those sectors. Advertising, Facebook doesn't lead. We think of these as all pretty competitive markets, but that's not a reason for not regulating in smart ways. Because as I said at the beginning, there are essentially governmental functions that a lot of these companies find themselves compelled to serve in a lot of situations, and so it's appropriate for government to intervene in those spaces. And again, from our perspective, we think it's privacy, election integrity, harmful content, and data portability. In the first instance.
We're reaching our time limit here, and we're going to have to wrap up. And you just said Facebook doesn't dominate in advertising. I mean, there are a lot of people who are going to challenge that. So, do you want to? You're pointing to Google. You're saying Google, but there are a lot of folks who would argue that there's a duopoly in dominance here, Facebook and Google. And I don't know if you just would disagree with that or.
I mean, I think there are a lot of people that would argue. I'm stepping into the antitrust domain, which is not my expertise.
Yeah.
I'm focused on content. But I mean, depending on how you define the market, you get very different answers. But even if you narrowly define it as digital online advertising, Facebook is not.
Okay, well.
Right, so if you narrowly define it as digital online advertising, which I think every competition commission globally has distinguished this is how you need to define market. But I was just going to say, I think there's one actually case that we have on the books in the Northern District of California that defines the market as social network digital advertising online.
So can I refer back to Harold's book briefly? Because rather than focusing on market definitions, I'm really interested in this cost of exclusion theory that was teed up. I don't know how to calculate that yet, but I do have some notes on one of my pieces of paper where I was starting to map out like there's a coefficient A times the function of the value of data, and a coefficient B times the function of the value of the network, and then some third coefficient Z times the function that involves both of those two elements coming together. Like you can start to map that out. We'll talk more about that later. But I do think it's more useful to think about those metrics rather than to focus on market definition questions, which is just fundamentally
Well, first of all, help me thank our panel for coming up here and wrestling with all of we could keep going for a long time. We can't tonight. It's 8 o'clock, and that's the end of our program. But I want to thank you all for, first, I want to thank everyone who's been watching on streaming. Appreciate it. I want to thank you all who came out in person. We don't get out to the West Coast a lot at public knowledge, and so when we do, we really appreciate you guys coming out and supporting and engaging in these important discussions. Final thank you again to our sponsors, Postmates and Mozilla, for helping us put this together. There's a lot of refreshments in the back, so please hang out, come and talk